Passwords are not working. 81% of hacking-related breaches are related to stolen or weak passwords, according to the Verizon Data breach report. They don't protect your apps, they're not protecting your customers, and this expectation that humans are suddenly going to start remembering long, high-entropy strings is just ridiculous. So today on the Confident Defense podcast, I sit down with the Chief Technology Officer for Beyond Identity. And in our conversation, we dive into what are the alternatives for building trust on the internet? How do we improve security and customer experience? And how having a centralized identity service in the back end can help you safely scale as your company is growing. So if you're interested in the technical nuts and bolts of how this works, down here in the description, we've got linked to the white paper where we talk about things like how OICD is used for integration, how they're using the latest of Intel's SGX chips for building trust into the hardware and building off of that. It's an incredible architecture, it's an incredible platform, and most importantly, it's a great conversation. So please, kick back, enjoy today's conversation with Jasson Casey, the CTO of Beyond Identity. Pioneering solutions, transformational technology, and inspirational leaders. I'm your host, Connor Sherman, and this is the Confident Defense Podcast. Welcome to the Confident Defense Podcast. I'm your host, Connor, and today we've got a particularly exciting episode about a pain point that almost every chief technology officer and every chief security officer is feeling, and that is how do you protect customers in your platform? So today we're joined by Jasson Casey. He's a CTO for Beyond Identity, an identity management platform that is focused on killing the password. Jasson, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So dude, I've been so excited to have this conversation because this has just been this critical pain point that I think that every CTO and CSO is feeling, who the CTOs and CSOs for like SaaS companies, high impact software companies. And there's almost this impossible situation I think most people find themselves in. Like, how do you protect our customers when our customers don't care about security until something bad happens? How do you put in the right controls but if anything has an impact on cart abandonment or user conversion, that's a showstopper. Then we've got customers who just have this default insecure experience. Like a Google report recently said that 65% of all people surveyed reuse the same passwords across multiple sites. And at the same time, you've got this weaponization and increase of account takeovers happening. Some other reports have said that since COVID has come out, they've seen an increase of 378% account takeovers coming. So you've got like this perfect storm of increased adversary, harder to break into markets. It's like the perfect storm for complacency. So I wanted to talk about what you and the team are doing at Beyond Identity and why is it that you guys are focused on getting beyond the password?
Yeah. If memory serves, Google followed that up with a report where they would actually pop in front of a user. It not only if they were using a weak password, but if it was actively circulating on the underground, like if it was possible to purchase their credential. And I think and then they went so far as to saying, let us help you change your password. And I think it was like 1 in 6, some unacceptably crazy number of people then said, nah, I'm good, let's go.
I'll find that research and link to the show notes because that's insane.
Yeah, no, it was crazy. And well, actually it's not crazy. And this gets at the fundamental essence of passwords and knowledge factors. When you look at authentication that use knowledge factors, and when you look at what makes a good knowledge factor, technically, a good knowledge factor, it's this thing that has high entropy. Well, what does that mean? It means it's like a string of random bits, right? And how great are you, or are your parents, or your brother and your sister at remembering a string of random bits that is unique for each service they actually use, right? So it turns out like human factors and knowledge-based credentials are fundamentally just an incompatible concept, right? And when you get back to some of those statistics that you were going through, right, like all of these incidents, well, not all of them, but like 80% or 86% of these incidents, they all start with a password, right? I get you to reveal a password. I realize you're reusing a password and purchased your password on the dark web. I get access to a credential dump and I run a password cracker against it, right? And I realize you're using like two common words joined together with 1, 2, 3 at the end, or bang at the end, or X, you know what I mean? So like there's this message in the data that's actually screaming really, really loud. And what it's telling us is human factors and how you're solving security are fundamentally at odds. And if you really want to eliminate, or at least move the security conversation off of this 80% and onto the next problem, you have to solve the security problem of authentication while also solving for human factors, right? You can't just expect people to do something that's mathematically correct. You have to do something that a human is likely to be successful at repeating. And that really is kind of what got us started about like passwords are flawed, fundamentally flawed for that reason. They don't consider human factors. They don't consider the psychology of how someone is, how much mental real estate is the average person willing to give your site to do X. And then the behaviors you mentioned take over, right? Like, I don't want shopping cart abandonment under X%. And if I'm going to, hey, this password is fishy because we got from our threat intel, it's on the dark web. This isn't the location they're used to, so I'm going to send you a text message, send you a push notification, have your neighbor ring your doorbell, and if two out of the three, marketing's not going to allow that, right? So yeah, that's kind of how we got started, which is fundamentally realizing that like this huge point of surface area of like the modern attack, it either starts with the password or the password ends up being a critical point. So let's not make a better password. Let's not invent something that's a password by another name.
Right.
Let's actually get at the root of the problem. And that's really kind of where our journey starts.
Because I've seen this kind of rise too, where a lot of systems still use passwords, but they're just kind of masking it with a different abstraction layer. So it's still like password authentication in the background and going through. So what are you guys doing that's like moving these platforms from just using passwords or an alternate version of that to something completely different? Like, what does that journey look like?
So there's a story about like under the hood, what are the enabling technologies that make it possible, and then there's the more practical story in terms of like what's the end user experience and how do we actually impact the company. So under the hood, it's really about focusing on what is authentication at the end of the day. We've all been classically taught it's something you are, it's something you know, it's something you have. Well, how many data points can you really mine out of those dimensions to build a profile about who someone likely is? And it turns out there's a lot of data points you can mine without ever having to go to a knowledge factor or a global complex knowledge factor or those sorts of things. So we focus on that. The system is it's underwritten, if you will, like the underwriter. It's not the bank. It's asymmetric cryptography.
Yep.
Right? Because the great thing about asymmetric cryptography is you shift the risk, right? You shift it from these password databases to the endpoints themselves. So if there's no password database, I don't get 90 opportunities to crack passwords in one harvest. I get a bunch of public keys, which just help me understand who someone. Yeah, that guy signed that check. That looks like him.
Yeah, and that's it. You
right?
can't authenticate as that individual.
Now, there's a lot more that you have to do than just that, right? That's kind of like the underwriting layer. That's how do we guarantee certain things. But the other part of it really boils down to when someone wants to access a service, when someone wants to buy a product, when someone wants to log into a bill payment system, they're executing a transaction, if you will, right? And so there's a question of what's the risk to the device they're on? What's the risk the identity is who they claim to be? What's the impact and criticality of the thing they're trying to do? And in that moment of time, can I bring those data points together and make an informed decision of whether I want to allow this behavior to happen? Or put in the jargon of the industry, right? Is the current risk being mitigated? Or do I want to be more dynamic, right? Do I want to try and the risk is higher than what I'm comfortable with, and there are avenues to buy down that risk. Do I want to trigger some things and try and buy down that risk? So that's the spirit of what's happening under the hood. But from a customer experience and an end user experience, it actually can be a lot more seamless. It can be as seamless as, I'm opening my app to buy a thing, and when I open my app, the authentication and the login's actually happening under the hood, right? Mm-hmm. And all of those data points that I mentioned can transact without actually involving the user, unless something about the risk in the moment is uncomfortable, right? So that is a great end user experience, right?
Yeah.
And a great end user experience from a customer's perspective, and this is in the CIAM space, is all about low friction. And that gets back to that point we made earlier. You can't solve the password problem if you're not also thinking about the user behavior, the user experience journey. If you don't have user design and security working together, you're not really solving this problem.
That's a really good point. Let's just dive into that for a second, because I've seen this way too many times. It's the classic, do you build security on or do you build security in? Right? The analogy I use sometimes is like, when you're building the car, do you build the seatbelts in during the car, or do you just build a car and then wrap it in bubble wrap? Right? If you try to slap security on at the end, it's like, yeah, technically it's going to be less of an impact, but you're not going to go very far very fast if you try and put it on, and you have this terrible experience and the car doesn't function. So I like this idea that you guys are bringing to market, which is you can really give people a increased user experience, not just that it's because you are, while making it more secure, right? These are not two things that have to be at odds. And I think we've been classically taught that you have to choose speed or security, convenience or security. But by getting rid of the broken mechanisms, i.e. in this case, the password being one of them, you can do both. Mm-hmm.
I would phrase it even stronger. I would say it's not just that you can do both at the same time, which we certainly believe is possible, but I would actually put it by ignoring human factors, you're putting your users more at risk, because it turns out your users aren't going to change your behavior, aren't going to change their behavior. They're going to behave the same way they've always behaved, right? And so if you give them something that is outside of their trainability, they're going to ignore it, or they're going to exacerbate the problem, as we are seeing with passwords today.
So this is I know we're talking a lot about the authentication experience, but I want to take it one step further, because when I think about, as you start to think about identities in general in this customer identity space, there's more to worry about. It's more to think about when a CTO or a technology leader is thinking about, how do we do this? I've seen some companies, and you get under the hood, and it's just like they're using the local library of the language, and they're just rolling their own authentication every time. They're, and they have all these. It's like, oh great, we have users with the ID, it sits in a database, and we use this library, and it's like, it seems that when you start to unpack identity access management, customer identity access management, or CIAM as it is, or I think as people pronounce it, there's more to it than just the authentication experience. So can you walk us, what are some of the key points that we go through? Like the front door, making a safe front door through authentication is important, but what are some of the other aspects that, when they're done well and they tie together, give us this and not or situation you're talking about?
So just to reemphasize the point, right? There's protocol design and there's protocol implementation, right? So I can design something on a whiteboard or a sheet of paper, and then with the right mathematical rigor, we can prove certain things about that protocol design, right? And that's kind of what happens in the academic sense when we're talking about cryptographic algorithms, cryptographic protocols, secret sharing protocols, those sorts of things. We could do an incredible job at that stage, and then hire we'll call it the E team, right, for error, to do the protocol implementation. And everything that we worked out to the perfect degree could completely go out the window, right? Because if you don't implement things correctly, if you don't have certain security practices when you're actually writing software, you can actually weaken the protocol itself, right? And weaken the core assumptions that it relies upon. So, a solution that works well in an identity space, clearly it has to focus on the security from a design perspective, right? These cryptographic protocols, but it has to carry it through from an implementation perspective. And it also has to take into account user behavior, call it security UX, right? It has to take into account security UX, because your users can weaken your system.
Yes.
Right? and it's all about building something that is ergonomic with their behaviors, or maybe it's like like a 1/1000th of an inch off of their behavior, and you just need a slight variation that you could train. But if it's fundamentally different, right? Like if it's, I'm expecting you to keep in your head, not written down, a high entropy bit string that you rotate that's unique for all the services you use. Like, no.
Humans are just terrible at that. Yes.
And then there's this fourth thing. And the fourth thing is, well, actually, maybe we can debate whether it's fourth or it's really one of the other three properties. But it also has to be easy on the administrators or the developers, right? So if we're in the CIAM space, it's some combination of software engineers and developers, right? If we're in the workforce space, it's security engineers and identity engineers. But when I say easy is the system has to integrate into their existing understanding and knowledge space or domain of experience. It has to plug into systems that they use. It has to kind of, you're more likely to not commit sins in the security realm by using protocols that have been vetted, right? By implementing them correctly and by plugging into those integration points in either software or services that already know how to speak that, right? So I'm specifically thinking of like JWTs and how they end up getting used with like OIDC properly. I'm specifically thinking about things like lifecycle, right? The fundamental mistake a junior software engineer makes when they start using writing programs in like systems programming languages is they'll allocate memory off the heap and they'll forget to delete it, right? And then this whole industry of languages got invented after, basically kind of assuming the programmer is going to forever be lazy and will just kind of sweep up after them. And that's actually, that works for a lot of problems, but certain problems themselves require like solutions in the systems domain, right? Which means you have to use those languages, which means you have to think about life cycle, right? All things are born and all things die, and all things in between those 2 points get permuted. Identities are no different, right? So how do I provision identities in a system that is passwordless and underwriting this authentication? How do we do that in a way that's easy? How do we do that in a way that's mechanized, right? You're not going to get an IT administrator or a software developer to play with your system if they can't do something useful in 10 minutes.
Yes, and I think that is the thing that is, I would actually call it a fourth leg versus a part of the other three properties, because it is also forgotten that there is an operational cost to everything that we implement. And technically today with like passwords, like we've kind of just shifted that operational burden a lot to the customer, to like, and then we just blame the customer and we blame the individual who's doing it for their bad practices, versus had we had a better solution that we wouldn't have had that problem. Right?
Yeah, operator error, operator ignorance is the typical excuse.
Yeah, PEPCAC has done more damage than most malware. It's a problem existing between keyboard and mouse. So, like, you kind of started to talk about this a little bit, like, but let's take the other side of that coin. What are some of those downsides that really materialize in your mind when people start to roll their own identity solution and they don't go down thinking through those four pillars you're talking about, but they go for, hey, I'm really good at this language, I'm going to steal the library du jour to roll my own identity and everything will be fine. Because that seems to be really... it seems to be, it's a low friction decision. You're in the moment, you're a startup, you're getting going, you're like, great, I'm using Ruby, I'm going to use the devise library, on I go, and life is fine. Yep. So what are some of those downsides that forward-thinking leaders need to be bringing into their mind?
So yeah, I mean, when you roll your own system, like the problems that you can run into is you're now putting yourself in the driver's seat of, you now have to stay on top of trends of threat, right, and of trends of development and of trends of new protocols, right? When you use a system, at least at a layer that kind of abstracts identity for you, you're putting that burden on whoever is providing that system to you, right? When you roll your own system, you also can commit the sins of just implementing things incorrectly, right? Making things easy to actually be exploitable, right? You roll your own authentication. You think you're following the revised Needham-Schroeder algorithm correctly, but it turns out you're not, right? There's a lot of ways of getting these things wrong, and for some companies, rolling your own may be the solution. but generally it's not true from an implementation perspective, from a lifecycle management perspective, from a recruiting perspective. Like, are you really going to be able to recruit, maintain, retain, and grow a set of engineers that are really on top of the core and the guts of that technology? And then the other thing is, if identity truly is moving in this world that enhances end user experience, that eliminates these knowledge factor, then there are other signals that become really, really important in asserting identity. Signals of behavioral science, right? Hey, what are the patterns of access of this identity? And is this inside or outside that pattern of access in terms of time, in terms of space, in terms of intent? Is building a model on a per user and per user peer group and per peer group basis? Is that really in the domain of your identity, of the engineer that you said, hey, go roll an identity directory?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point on the risk models for identities. I mean, so I just kind of want to cap this. So we're talking about so how is it that you guys think about the risks of identities and building out those models? Is there a particular framework? Okay, we usually use the 3-step model we go through. What does that look like?
So at a high level, it's super simple, like all things, right? We can make it a cartoon or we can make it a PhD. But we'll start up here. So to start with, it's really, what's the risk that this identity claimed is the actual in fact identity, right? And so that's the high level question that you're actually trying to answer. And in some sense, it's an ideal that you build a system around, right? But the way you build a system up is you start with things like pattern of access, right? So and this is kind of like a baseline level of statistics. So think of it as having a distribution or a model that tells me John, right? What are John's temporal access patterns look like? What are John's application access patterns look like? What are John's geo access patterns look like? When I fuse those things together in these terms of higher dimensional models, what is the shape of this, right? In terms of mean, 1 sigma, 2 sigma, that sort of thing. And so you can build these models up to give you some level of confidence of normal behavior or non-normal behavior, but that's not enough, right? So then you have other forms of enrichment that come from the world of things like threat intelligence, right? And not just threat intelligence, but just generalized data enrichment. Is John operating from a sanctioned country right now, right? Is John using an IP address that's frequently used as a Tor exit node? And these are kind of easy things to kind of point out. But then you also have all these other device signals, right? So depending on the mode of deployment, remember, we're trying to answer the question not just of identity risk, but of device risk. And a lot of those data points that you're collecting on the device also tell you about kind of behavioral constraints of the person. So for instance, has something about the configuration state of the machine changed drastically, and it doesn't usually change.
Right. It's someone just dump LSAS, the process, and steal the password from it on a Windows endpoint or something like that. Or on a mobile device. So, okay, is this device now rooted when it wasn't rooted beforehand?
So our process is to build a set of risk scores using those styles of approaches and make those available in something we call a policy engine, right? And the whole idea there is each of our customers, they have a slightly different surface area. They have a slightly different risk profile. They care about a slightly different set of events than their peers, right? And when you look across all customers, you clearly have this big spectrum, but mostly you get clustering. What the policy engine allows, it allows customers to actually not be under the thumb of an opinionated system that tells them what risk is. It lets them actually match the mitigations that they like to the risk that their business truly cares about.
And that just seems so much more sane and grown up than the process we have today, which is the PCI standard says X, OWASP Top 10 says Y, or whatever framework du jour you have to be under compliance with. It literally just says, here's the risk, here's your mitigation, go implement. And it just doesn't work for everybody, right? There is this sense of there is a uniqueness. Well, there are principles that carry through, which is always true. There is a uniqueness of experience that needs to be adjusted for.
this may sound obvious when I say it out loud, but like the benefit of the experience I got working in the risk ratings industry was just doubling down on that idea. Like every organization has a slightly different view on risk and the importance of risk and the criticality of risk to their business than their neighbor. And if you bring them a model that they have no ability to kind of tailor to their world, it ends up being a little bit difficult, right? But if you bring them a system that says, here's kind of baseline, and we're going to allow you to actually define what risk is in your system, so you can kind of get the best of both worlds, right? If you don't be opinionated, if you actually let them define their risk in your product, you move past a certain set of objections that are just really, really difficult to get through, and almost even philosophical in some points, right? Are you really going to change someone's philosophical view of the world? And at the end of the day, is that really your job, or is your job just to make it, I can be as crystal clear about here's what the world looks like to you, and then give you the ability to decide what you care about?
Got it. Yeah, and I completely agree with that, because you end up, again, it's just going back into that fourth pillar that you talked around on the operational side of that. And well, part of that is the decision-making process on what are those thresholds, what gets implemented, how do we define as a team how we do lifecycle management, so on and so forth. And every tech team has their own culture around that, has their own, we call it risk, but really it's just risk is part of it, but it influences that culture that kind of wraps itself around this.
I'll give you another specific example. So there's this area called device trust, right? And the idea of device trust is I only want to allow devices I trust to do a thing. And you really quickly start to realize, well, what does device trust mean? And when you start digging into a lot of these products, it ends up being a product was set up, and during that setup time, certain things were checked, certain things were done, right? Firewall was enabled, just encrypted that. And once all of that was done, then like a flag was planted on the device, right? Or a certificate was dropped. And henceforth, anyone who sees that certificate or that flag knows they can then trust the device. Mm-hmm. And if you don't think too hard, it's like, oh yeah, that seems kind of reasonable. Except you're kind of compressing all of this information in kind of a lossy way, right? You're losing the essence of the question itself. And the question itself is, when someone is doing something of importance, maybe they're moving money, right? In that moment of time, is their device configured in a way that has the visibility controls and the responsive controls that I actually expect to be present? As opposed to asking kind of like this transitive question, right? Like if A is less than B and B is less than C, then A therefore must be less than C, right? Like, just ask the question you want.
But yeah.
And then the very next part of that ends up being the question you want to ask is very personal to companies. Mm. Like, it's not the same. There's a big overlap, but there's also a slight divergence. And so being opinionated about what device trust is also like kind of this big gap that we saw in the market. And just jump to the questions you want to ask and get the answers in real time.
And I think that real time is what really seems to be is the thing that's missing in our industry today. And I find that like the security industry overall it's getting better, but for a long time it was either we do a point in time check or we do a continuous check. But there's a lot of space in between where we don't need to be checking. Like, we don't need to take up that computation, that space, that whatever, that friction. We don't need that, because as you mentioned, you only need to know the moment. What is the moment of trust at the moment of transaction? Or what is the identity state at that transaction, and building out that profile.
And that doesn't mean you're not continuously reinforcing your model, right? All that means is you're just not asking for expensive resources until you actually need them. And when you do need them, make sure your data's fresh.
I remember like back in the day, we had like, this is about a decade ago now, the biggest thing was like Cisco AnyConnect VPNs, and like it would then check the device posture of the device, and it was going to solve all of our problems. And as we got into it, you were like, wait, you want to check all of these registry settings, all of these things in the Windows world. Let's add the equivalent in Linux as well, and Mac. But it was just like this so burdensome all the time, and it led to all these weird issues because like you'd be calling to these system libraries at the same time some other random application was doing it too, and it's like at 2:00 in the afternoon we didn't really care what the state in that moment. We cared when you moved into, okay, now I'm uploading something to my legal drive. Okay, I care about at that point, or I'm jumping onto the network remotely from a coffee shop. I care at that point. I mean, just to really make a VPN specific example of this.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so
there's a computer architecture parallel too, right? Like the ultimately, there's a couple tools that just kind of they recur over and over and over that ultimately you have to pay attention to get through those sorts of problems, which is like caching, right? Like speculation, right? What's the cost of being wrong versus what's the speed up of being right 90% of the time? And when you're wrong, can you fix it in time before it actually hurts, right? Those are all like I don't know, that's a little bit of soapbox thing, but I feel like there's some fundamental rules of computer science, and doesn't matter if you're doing like high performance computing, chip design, compiler design, or just a general distributed system. It all comes down to like data flow dependency. When you don't have the data, can you speculate? What's the cost of being wrong, and can you fix it? And then can you cache certain things? And anyway,
now it'd be great if those principles were more widely talked about and like be outside of like the computer science cohort, but just more generally. It's just like, okay, hey, we're going to build an instant response program, like to make it completely security related. It's like, great, we have security architecture, defense of death, we have these things in place. Cool. Now, what is the cost of being wrong? What's the cost of being right? That's where your instant response and detection response comes in place. How's the speed of that? And if we had a more sophisticated conversation in certain circles, I think the cost of securing systems would come down and the efficacy would go way up versus trying to secure all of the things all of the time.
Actually, you're right. There's a general principle there, because I have this conversation with our product managers all the time in terms of like, people are coming to you for decisions all the time, right? And it doesn't mean you have to give them an answer when they come, but like it does mean you have to have some understanding of like, what's the cost of being wrong? What's the cost of being right? Is this something I truly need to give them an answer for now? Or is this something that like, what's the cost of delay, right?
And if we make the wrong decision, how quickly can we back out of it and adjust, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about this idea of like really leaning into leaning into identities as a mechanism for scale. I think this is something that people maybe gets overlooked, right? So I think through like companies that are 500-600 people, they're Series B, they're getting ready to do big things, but they've built a non-scalable way. They kind of rolled their own identity access management, and now they're realizing that they're going to have scaling issues going forward. This is a pretty industry-wide problem. So can we talk about like what a CIAM or I know what people call it CIAM or CIAM. I read it. I don't really talk about it. So let's call it CIAM.
Let's make up our own that just sounds ridiculous and see if we can get people saying it.
There we go. So we'll start up a Twitter storm of this. So secure identity management. So SIM. We're going to call it SIM. Is that a security thing as well? But yeah, so let's talk about that. So it's like this idea of scalability. I think it gets lost it just gets lost in the conversation. So where does having a good platform help organizations with that scale?
Sure. So, any company that doesn't flame out, by definition, is going to experience growth, and unfortunately, you can't always predict where it's going to come from, right? And so, having a solution that actually scales from a design from the beginning, right, at the design level, ends up being kind of almost necessary. Otherwise, you get jammed, right? So. Hey, did you realize like 10% of your user base is actually coming out of Eastern Europe or Central Europe? Did you realize all of a sudden that South America or Latin America is going to be really important to the marketing strategy? Did you realize that our user research basically is suggesting that any sort of latencies on getting into our application over 1 to 2 seconds inside of Latin America is going to lead to X% of abandonment? So these are the things that absolutely impact the business. Yeah. But when you're first getting started, whether you're building a new product inside of a big company or a small company, product or marketing or whoever the business driver is for you, they don't care about scalability and performance. They care about the essence of the product, right? Like, are you able to do the thing that brings the value to the person with money, right? And so all of these necessary sacrifices are always made in terms of expediency to try and prove that loop out, right? Like build a prototype that does the fundamental thing. Nobody gets out of bed in the morning at any of these companies thinking, I can't wait to work on my identity and password reset system this morning, right? They think about like, ooh, we're going to model our customers to understand and partition them into like, our power users and make sure that we present these things to them a little bit differently than the non-power users, right? They get the essence of their product. And so if they're doing that necessarily, right, that's what they should be doing. And they're doing a good job of it, their product eventually is going to start scaling. And you're going to need certain things in place for a couple different scenarios. Number one is data centers go down, right? Even if you're in Amazon.
Yeah.
And it turns out your customers don't like it when they try and do something on your product and it doesn't work.
Nope, that's a big one.
Surprise, surprise. And then the second thing is customers also don't like to wait, right? And so forcing your Indian customers or your Eastern Africa customers to come all the way back to Virginia to gain access to a service is not it's not a great user experience. It's not going to endear you to that part of the world. So whether we're talking about like regional expansion, international expansion, or even just availability and performance, scale is fundamental in any application today, right? And scale starts with identity. It starts with understanding and partitioning who is this user, are they who they claim to be, and are they authorized to do the thing that they're saying? And as we talked about in the very beginning of this talk, like user experience has to be first and foremost in that process, right? It has to be low latent, which means it has to be out in that region. It can't get jammed when a Super Bowl ad comes out and all of a sudden 10,000 people all try and do the same thing at the same time. So again, if that's not the point of your business, but that's a necessary function of your business, why wouldn't you use a component in your product to help you sail through that set of problems?
Yeah, and it seems like it's such a far better use of resources to focus on like hiring people to do integration and using a back-end service versus like, again, building your own. There was this great quote from an article I came across from the author is Laura Nutt, and it says, you can't spend every day making sure your login is its safest. But that is exactly what a customer identity access management platform does. It's like
it is what we do.
Exactly, and the good ones do it, and they're spending all day, every day, building this out.
Yeah, what's your tip? What is the tip of your spear, right? What is the purpose of your business? What is the purpose of you, right? And everything that's not your purpose but is necessary, should you do it, or can you get a higher quality service, thing, or product from someone that can, freeing you up to focus on the thing that matters most to you?
And I think one of the things that we're starting to see now is with like these privacy legislations that are coming out. Well, they're out and they're full force, not coming out. They're here. So GDPR has been around, CCPA, CPRA.
Yeah. I get out of bed in the morning. You know what I really want to work on? Consent management.
Yeah, nope. No one ever said that ever. Exactly. It's like people hate, like it's one of those things where it's really hard to do if you're trying to, in my experience, I'm sure you relate to this as well, it's like, but like, if again, you have fragmented identity space, understanding where somebody is in 4 different apps that you own, and then they say, forget my data, is actually incredibly difficult. So this idea of like having a central repository of like, oh, Connor lives here and he has authorization into all of these places, it's got to make data management that much easier.
It makes it a ton easier. Not only does it make it a ton easier, but then there are also hooks and provisions that you can get into around distributing data in a private sense and providing like one-time unlocks, right, under certain authorizations. It gives you a lot of flexibility to actually have a ground-up kind of globally scalable system that has not just identity risk built into it, but also a concept of data provenance, data governance, and even data sovereignty, right? Which and they all end up being slightly a little bit different.
And the fact that you guys are doing this in a way that kills the thing that sucks the most, passwords, is just pretty incredible. Going back to the human.
Well, yeah, so that's the thing, right? People find us because they're looking for passwordless solutions, but we're not building a passwordless product. We're building the next generation of an identity product that truly consolidates the security aspects of identity with the privacy aspects of the data related to the people and machines that you're tracking, and doing that in this kind of ground up way. If you build it right, passwords go away as a byproduct. It's like the first feature.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the endpoint. It's not the destination. It's the first milestone, if you will.
So on that note, Jason, where should people and how should people be connecting with you and the larger team at Beyond Identity if they do want to explore and go deeper and start solving this problem?
Sure. So it's super easy to connect to Beyond Identity. Just come to our website, beyondidentity.com. We actually launched a free tier of our product recently. So anyone who actually wants to use just the passwordless component of our product can actually do that for free. And that's kind of how much we believe in all of these other aspects. We don't limit it to a number of identities. We don't limit it to a number of devices. We don't limit it to a region. We don't limit it to time. It's truly a free tier product. With that said, we do want to convince you that you can get a lot out of our risk engines and our policy engines and some of our advanced policy techniques and the ability to share policies and whatnot. But we're certainly happy to get you up and get the passwords out of your system just to start with. So that's just kind of coming in through our website. For me personally, I'm on Twitter and I'm on LinkedIn, and I post pretty regularly on LinkedIn, but most of my posts on LinkedIn are really about recruiting, right? I'm always looking for engineers. I'm trying to hire 30 more engineers in the next couple of days. I'm trying to hire another 100 in the next 12 months. So we're always looking for people that are interested in a challenge and kind of like the types of problems we've been talking through. And I don't post as much on Twitter, but I do. I'm more of a lurker. Right. I do read everything you get.
I think I would probably put myself in the same category on Twitter, a bit of a lurker. A little bit of content every once in a while, but I'm definitely more consuming from the great network out there. So thank you so much for your time, Jason. I've really appreciated the conversation and the insights that you've brought. And then I will say to everyone who's listening today, as I release this, all the things that we've referenced and talked about will be in the show notes as well. So, Jason, thank you again for a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, no worries.